on inside and get yourself something cool to drink.
Welcome back. Welcome back to another edition of Between the Lines podcast, brought to you by Lost in Translation Podcast on the Black Men Unfiltered Network. Thank you guys for coming in. It has been one heck of a journey, man, with this 3-part series. Today, we're going to talk about marriage. Is it survival or is it for success? And I think I'm going to take my time today, man, and talk to you guys because it's one of those situations where I don't think we really have conversations like we used to have. You know, it's always performative. You know, people want to get on and they want to have the presentations, whatever. But today, I'm just going to have a regular old conversation with y'all today. And I do appreciate y'all for showing up. Last week, we talked about the difference between marrying for survival and then the week before that was success and how people actually view marriage. And when I was doing some research, I actually took a look at it and was going through different ways people look at marriage. And I decided to do a little on the streets research and talk to other people and just kind of eavesdrop and listen to other people in their podcasts and stuff like that on TikTok, YouTube, and listen to see how everybody was doing that thing and what their perspective was. And one of the things I thought about was that most people had a different idea of what marriage is. And I don't think if you don't have that consensus between the two people that's getting married, I think that's where the conflict comes in. There's this missing of expectations that leads the marriage astray. And when I was doing my research, I was trying to figure out exactly what are some of the tangibles and intangibles when it comes to marriage. And I couldn't help but notice there was more intangibles than tangibles. And I'm thinking to myself, I think that might be for a reason. You know, if we look at it biblically and how it's done, God really doesn't get anything from helping us, but he does it anyway, you know? And I think those are the intangibles. And I think when we do this thing the way he wants us to do it, I think we're better for it. We're better people. We're able to listen to each other more. And I thought that was incredible. Tonight, we're going to talk about the components and the expectations of what goes into marriage and the benefits of it. And we're going to close this thing out tonight. I just want to make sure that we have an understanding of what the basics of marriage is and the foundation of it. I think the real reason why most people get married is for tradition. Sometimes it's for survival. Sometimes it's for success. I've seen situations where people have married into families, you know, huge families married together for money, you know, for survival, you know, that type of thing, you know, businesses and stuff like that. Those are usually arranged marriages, but for the most part, over here in America, it's usually because people, you know, they care about each other. Well, one of the aspects of getting married to somebody else is actually marrying the other person's family as well, too, and how well you guys blend together. I don't know about y'all, but looking at your spouse, sometimes you want to take a look back at when you're choosing your spouse and you have to think to yourself, is this somebody my grandkids would love to call grandma? You know what I'm saying? Is she tender? Is she sweet? I don't know if y'all remember y'all grandma, but y'all think your grandma was probably one of the most special people in the world to you. I don't know about y'all, but I think that when we start picking, you know, people, it's what we look at in the end. Is this somebody my kids would be proud to call grandma? You know, and for the ladies, is this somebody that my kids would be proud to call grandpa? You know what I mean? And if you notice that your grandparents were always patient with you, you know, they wouldn't cast judgment. They would just sit back and marvel and look. And I think most of the time when they're looking at you, they're looking at themselves. And they're seeing how life starts all over again. They see a little bit of themselves in you. And I think spending that time with grandparents and grandkids, they have a special bond. And it's like nothing I've ever seen before. It's like grandparents love to give to the grandkids. And the grandkids just love receiving from the grandparents. And every time I saw my grandfather on my daddy's side, he would always, you know, give us a few little dollars or whatever when my dad wasn't looking. I was like, yeah, I like that. He was like, don't spend it all in one place now. Pull a few little dollars in your pocket. And every time I saw my granddad, he always had something, for us. And then he would give us little words of wisdom in between, giving out that money or whatever. So I always thought that was kind of cool. Now, my granddad on my mom's side, that was different. He was a man of many few words, but he was always the spiritual leader of that side of the family. He was a trustee, deacon, all of that stuff, man. And he was one of those guys where he spoke softly and carried a big stick. You know what I'm saying? You didn't want to give him no hard time. You know what I'm saying? So, and I noticed he had a certain tenderness about him that I don't think people really understood exactly who he was. He was a man of few words, but he was very tender in the way how he handled things. He didn't really have to beat his chest. He didn't have to, say he was the baddest or nothing like that. I think he led with love. And I think growing up in the church had a lot to do with that. Showing up, being dedicated every single Sunday, to open up the church and get things ready, man. He was a trustee, it was one of them things that he had to do. And I was like, man, that's magnificent just to show up every Sunday and to be a leader. You know what I mean? That is the blueprint. And, from time to time, whenever he had something to say, it was profound. He didn't waste a whole lot of words saying nothing. You know what I mean? And that's why I think about, the special bond between grandkids and grandparents and your aunts and your uncles and extended family. I think those are the people in your life that actually give you the latitude to continue on. I think about all the conversations that used to have one-on-one with cousins and brothers and nieces and nephews, and uncles, especially my uncles, you know what I mean? They would always tie your shoelaces, and your aunts, they would always have something kind to say. And they would always, help you along the way. And I think that is the reason why family is so important and the reason why you want to stick together. And that's the main reason why this construction of a family is so important. So you shouldn't take who you select for a spouse lightly. There's certain things you want to look for. And I think a lot of times in this day and age, people fear getting married because they might feel like they're picking the wrong somebody. Well, here's the thing about that. It's not so much as picking somebody that's wrong as you becoming the right person, being able to look at things in a certain way that you can have the humility to overcome other people's shortcomings sometimes. And hopefully you'll teach them to help them overcome some of your shortcomings, because we're not always the same. And sometimes we don't always reach the same level of compassion at the same time. But I think if we practice a little bit more by saying thank you, and I appreciate you from time to time, I think it creates an environment for love. And I really do think that we need to get back down to the basics of saying, yes, ma'am, no, ma'am, thank you. It's the basics. So if you can find somebody who can do that on a regular basis, well, that's the beginning of a good marriage, because you have a certain level of humility and a certain level of respect for one another. Respect each other's position in your life. Because think about it, it didn't have to be there. They could have chose somebody else. They could have been somewhere else, but they decided to be there for you. And I think we probably need to start telling people, hey, I appreciate you a little bit more, And then on top of that, marriage is a journey. It's not a sprint. And I think a lot of times, man, people think that they have to get everything they need in the beginning. Well, there's a certain perfection that happens along the way. Learning how to work with others, learning how to negotiate. I was listening to a podcast today, and they came up to an impasse that were talking about partners and husbands and wives. And then one lady was like, yeah, we're going to agree to disagree and then just move on. I was like, wait a minute. I had to pick up the mic and was like, hey, that's not how you do that. You don't say agree to disagree and then pat somebody on the head and then keep it pushing. No, that's not how that works. When you get into a relationship, man, that's one of those things. If you do that, people are like, I ain't gonna trust you. Because you didn't hear nothing what I said. You didn't want to make any concessions. You didn't want to listen to nothing. You just want to have your way, pat me on the head, and then sweep it under the rug. That's not what marriage is about. It's about compromise, making sure everybody gets a little something that they need out of it. Maybe you get 100% of what you want, the other person gets nothing this time. Maybe you guys split it and get 50-50, and maybe the other person gets 100% of what they want, you get nothing of yours. There's a range, you know? And I think that trust in that range is one of the things that helps people, you know, trust you in your relationship. Sometimes you have to learn how to negotiate. You know, you can't trick people out of the way they feel. There's a saying that I like to say all the time is, you know, it's a man convinced against his will is of the same opinion still. You know, you can't trick anybody out of the way how they feel and what they want. And I think sometimes in relationships, we don't always do that. You know, it's one of those things where we want to be heard, but we don't want to hear nobody else. That doesn't work in marriage. And I don't think your marriage will last long if all you did was pat somebody on the head and say, agree to disagree, and then ignore them. That's not going to work. Well, anyway, that's one of those situations where I tell you, you have to learn how to negotiate, you know. Another thing that I learned too is that by listening to other people, you kind of get a feel for what they really think about marriage. Some people think that marriage is one of those things where, you know, that's the finish line. You know, hey, I made it. You know what I'm saying? They have no idea that's just the beginning, man. You know, there's a lot of things along the way that you're going to have to experience. And I don't think we always think about that. Today, I had a conversation with a friend of mine, and it was like, you know, one day, if you live long enough, somebody's going to have to wipe your butt. And then she thought about it. She was like, man, I ain't looking forward to that. I was like, hey, you know, it's going to happen, man. As many times I talk to old people, man, and they get to the age and it's like, somebody's going to have to do something for you someday. And I think when we hear young people, you know, go off at the mouth and have this all rhetoric about, you know, I ain't finna do this and I ain't finna do that. Well, keep on living. One day somebody's going to have to wipe your butt. You know what I mean? And that's going to be one of the most humbling things you ever experienced in your life. I assure you that. But my thing is this, you have to make sure that you learn how to work together and listen to each other. And that's also good for us, know your mental health. That's one of those intangible things we're going to talk about today, mental health. Sometimes you don't know what's wrong with you until somebody who loves you gets around you. Say, for instance, if you're having a stroke or something like that, or your partner's having a stroke, now that person may not see their face twisted or whatever, but you can look over there and lean and say, hey, something ain't right. You don't seem like yourself. You don't sound like yourself. Those are some of those things that we take for granted because we always think that we got it. And sometimes the quickest people to understand something's wrong with you is those around you. And usually that's your spouse because they know you better than anybody else. They sleep next to you. You know, they work with you every day. They talk to you every day. Those are usually the signs of the first people who know something's wrong, you know? So that's the main reason why mental health is one of those things you have to have where, you know, your spouse is usually the first person to notice that. That's an intangible in marriage that you get. The next thing that is physical health, you know? There's always going to be a situation where you want to make sure you're optimum, you know, and your spouse is usually the first one to know, you know, when your physical health is off. You know, it's one of the things is the honey-do list to keep you healthy, you know, taking out the trash and painting the house and sand the floor and wax on, wax off like Daniel's son, you know what I'm saying? Keep you in tip-top shape, you know what I'm saying? Making sure you go to your doctor's appointments and all that good stuff, you know? Physical health is one of those things. Because sometimes we get busy in life, man. We want to continue to go, but we're not robots. Now, someday we're going to get old and we're going to fail, but the best way to do that is to make sure we take care of ourselves. And one of the ways to do is to make sure we get enough sleep, make sure we get enough rest, make sure we get enough exercise, and make sure we eat the right foods, you know? And think about it is people like to complain about cooking, but sometimes cooking is the most economical thing you can do and the most health conscious thing you can do because you can control what goes into your food. I can remember plenty of stories, man, of my grandmother going to the deep freezer, you know, and pulling out all type of stuff that she grew throughout the summer. And that was some of the best food ever, you know. It didn't have no preservatives in it. It didn't have no extra salt in it. She seasoned it the way she would. Sometimes she would cook that stuff all day long. When you got it, it tastes different. You can taste the love in it, you know? I think in this day and age, I don't think we put much love in our food. We go DoorDash and, from restaurant to restaurant or whatever. We don't know what them people put love in, and them people probably mad that they had to come in to work that day. And the food usually tastes like it too. What's happening, Red Lipstick Vibes? How you doing, darling? You know what I mean? It's just one of those situations where people don't put the love in the food like they used to. But if you take the time out to cook it the way you want to, you can do what you want to do with the food. Food is one of those things that should be something that enjoy, something you experiment with, And also you can use that to understand other people's cultures. Some weeks you can have Mexican, one week you can have Indonesian, you know what I mean? It's more than one way to cook. And that way you don't get bored with cooking. It's an exciting thing that couples can do together. You can learn how to cook together. One person chops this up, the other person stove, but you can use that time to bond, over a glass of wine or whatever it is you like to partake, and wind down, put on some music and enjoy each other's time. That is where the bond is made. Those little small moments in between life's emergencies, and nothing like having your spouse there while you're there cooking, and y'all doing the dishes together, spending time together. It's not always one of those situations where you do this and I do that or whatever. Sometimes you want to be next to your spouse. If they cooking, you want to cook. If they're in the yard, you want to be in the yard. They folding clothes, you washing clothes too. Use that opportunity to be with them, because you never know, man. Tomorrow is not promised. You don't know how long you got with that person. If you married them, you want to make sure you spend every moment that you can with them, especially if you got somebody good, And I hope everybody gets somebody good. And I hope you are somebody good to that person. Because I think that is the reason why most people get married anyway, to make sure that you get somebody that's good to you. Ain't nothing like somebody that's good to you. Every time you see them, your heart get warm, The world is full enough curmudgeons. We have enough of those. Sometimes you want to have somebody to rub your back, and sometimes you want to rub their back and let them know it's going to be all right. That's physical health. That's where that comes in. You got to have that. And you can't forget about financial health. I found out the other day that, if you have a spouse and they pass away, you get their retirement too. I'm like, wait a minute. So that way if something happens to your spouse, they can continue on without you. I think that's a bonus. When you're single, that's one of those things I think people take for granted. It's a plus, it's a bonus. And then not only that, you get to split, expenses or whatever, put everything in one pot and call it a day. Remember, y'all in this together. And I think a lot of people get wrapped up in this 50-50 and 100-100 or whatever. Marriage is give it all you got till the wheels fall off. You know what I'm saying? That's the reason why y'all got together anyway, to experience life together. And I can't think of anybody else who I'd spend my money with than with my boo. You know what I mean? And I think she thinks the same way. You do nice things for each other, especially when nobody's looking. I think that's the best time right there, And then give them a little, little love picks every now and then, little words of affirmation, a little appreciation. Let them know you appreciate them from time to time. That's the wind beneath your wings right there. That'll put some wind in your sail. That'll keep you going, I think the Bible talks about that too. It talks about making sure that you build up your house. A woman who tears down a house and uses her words, And I think a lot of times we do a bad job of advertising our spouses or our own people. We should get over the talking about each other thing, because that's bad advertising. You know what I mean? I see it a lot. I see a lot of women online talk about men like they're dogs. I'm like, well, that's real bad advertising for the rest of the world. Hey, come on in and don't do business with our man. He ain't worth a damn. You know what I'm saying? What kind of advertising is that? You know what I mean? Nobody's going to want to do business with your man. He ain't going to be able to retire you if he ain't going to get no work, because, you working against him. And then when you get your woman out there, and like, look at all these chicks out here twerking or whatever, they ain't finna do nothing. That's bad advertising. You're not putting a good word out there for your woman. But at the same time, we also have to carry ourselves a certain way too. We can't ask anybody to tell us how great we are. if we're going out making a fool out of ourselves. We want to make sure that the advertising matches what we bring to the table. If somebody says that, hey, you're wise, be wise. If somebody says that you're cordial, be cordial. If you're nice, be nice. That's one of the ways you can get people to do things that are nice. Just say, hey, I really appreciate the way you did this and the way you did that. And you'll start to find out that they will do things a little bit more the way you need them to, because you talked about it. Now they don't want to let you down. You know what I mean? So how you talk about your spouse is important. We call it edification. Write that down. It's in the Bible. You know what I mean? Always have something good to say about your spouse behind their back. That's a good thing. Because when they get back to them, could you imagine how somebody feels when they say, you know what, your spouse really does appreciate you. All she do is talk about the good stuff about you. And that's a good thing. That makes you want to go even harder. That's the reason why you always want to talk good about your spouse. You want to say nothing bad. That's called edification. We got to get better at that. We don't always, go out and put out a good word out for our folks. So generally when I talk about folks or whatever, I used to put out a good word and say, hey, go on over there to see Red Lipstick Vibes. She got a nice show. You'll love it. You know what I mean? That type of thing. Put it out there for her. Look out for your people. Not only that, a rising tide rises all ships. You want to make sure you give everybody that love and that push that they need, because you never know. That might have been the day they decided they wanted to quit. But now, since you done put the word out, they got to make one more video. They got to make one more stop, one more cut, one more edit. You know what I mean? One more show. That's one of the things you want to do, is you want to make sure you edify your folks around you, especially your spouse. The next thing you want to talk about, man, is spiritual health. Oh, man, that's one of the most important things. In order for you to do that right, you got to get yourself down in that word. Now, I don't know what you need to do or who you serve, but my thing is you need to serve somebody. You want to make sure you understand exactly the rules of marriage and how marriage works. It'll give you the blueprint on how that thing works, because every day you're not going to feel like it, but if you know who holds you up, you don't have to worry about what tomorrow holds. You'll understand exactly what it is. When you get into heated conversations, you know to back off. Remember, you got to have your fruits of the spirit too. You got to be patient. You got to be kind. You got to be long suffering. You got to be all of that stuff. And sometimes that's not always easy. That's the reason why spiritual health is one of those things where you have to do that and work together, because you'll be able to hold each other accountable. Like if one person, really goes off on the kid and says something, say, hey, I don't think you represented yourself well today when you're talking to the kids. I think you probably might want to apologize. I think you could have handled a little bit better. And here's how we're going to do that. How are we going to fix that? You hold each other accountable, because your kids remember how you treat them. They do. When they're older, I can tell, because when we get on these podcasts, that's all they do is talk about their childhood. And we want to make sure that we have a good childhood for our children going forward, because we've already had enough trauma as it is. I think we need to start pouring the love back in to reprogram, our children and reprogram our future with love. I think that's the best thing to do it. And for order to do that, your spiritual health has to be A1, top tier. You might not always want to go to church every Sunday, but you still want to get some word and you want to pray a little bit, that type of thing. God want to hear from you from time to time. Ain't nothing worse than having your little broke best friend showing up, always asking you for something. That's us. We God's little broke best friend. The only time we talk to them when we need something. Sometimes you might want to just say, hey, thank you from time to time. Your spiritual health is important, because the more you get into saying thank you, to God, the easier it is for you to say thank you to your spouse. And I think that thank you goes a long way. It really does. The next thing I want to talk to you guys about is legacy. How will you be remembered? How will people remember you? Those type of things. How will you establish things going forward for your family? How well are you teaching them to treat other people right? When you're long gone, will your teachers outlast you? How much time did you spend with people? You know, did you set aside some type of work ethic for your family tree going forward? You know, those type of things that people like to think about. Legacy is money. Think about, you know, generational wealth, that type of thing. But I think the way you treat others is more importantly your legacy. I could think about it anytime when I get on this podcast. I want to think that, you know, I represent my folks well. You know, I want to represent my grandfather, my father, my mother. You know what I mean? I represent them well. From time to time, we cut up or whatever, but I want to make sure I represent my brand well. You know, and other people who are associated with me. So I want to make sure I don't get out of hand. You know, and your wife and your spouse should be the same way. You know, you want to make them proud. You know, in Proverbs 31, it talks about the husband being known in the gates. You know, that means you carry weight. That means people know who you are. That means you're of good standing with people. And I think that's important. You know, that's a part of your legacy. That's also a part of marriage as well, too. Because going forward, what does your house name mean? You know, your last name. It's got to mean something. That's the importance of marriage, too, man. Making sure that legacy continues on. Making sure it's worth something, you know. Not only that, the next step, but it's another intangible about being married is personal growth. Personal growth is one of those things I think is overlooked because people like to think that personal growth is something that you can only do on your own. Well, personal growth is one of those things you can actually do better with your spouse because they can hold you accountable. You know, say, hey, I'm going to lose 5 pounds this week. And they're going to be like, well, how are you going to go about doing it? Well, you know, you need to cut a few meals here and add a few calories here and go in and exercise a little bit further here. What you going to be working on this week? You're going to be doing squats. Okay. You don't expect to lose too much weight on your legs because you're going to beef them up because you'll be, you know, getting your quads built up. You know, let's work on the upper body. You know, we can cut a little bit of, you know, weight off the top. You know, if we sweat you a little bit better up top. You know, that type of thing. Having those deep conversations, man, personal growth. You know, say, hey, look, let's read together. You know, that type of thing. And then having different conversations about deep thought in different situations and scenarios and say, hey, if you ran across this, how would you handle that situation? And what you do is you don't understand is that you're actually becoming of one mind. You know, I don't know if you've ever seen this before, but sometimes you'll have couples who will actually finish each other's sentences. I'm like, wait a minute. How did they do this? Because they've been around each other long enough. And if you really look, they start to look like each other. You know, after you start eating and start hanging around a certain person, you start to see them people look the same. They kind of look alike. Yeah, it's one of those things where that personal growth kicks in, man. You hang around somebody long enough, they'll start sounding like you and they'll be able to finish your sentences. That's how you know a couple been around a long time, when they can finish each other's sentences. Now, the next one is relief against burnout and stress. People don't understand, man. When you go to work, sometimes the pressures of life come down on you, man. Sometimes your spouse will relieve you, you know, against burnout and stress. Just having somebody to hug, somebody to hold, somebody to tell you it's going to be all right. You know, somebody to run your bath water every now and then and wash your back, you know, that type of thing. You know, that type of stuff goes a long way because that person gives you the reason why you continue to do what you do. Marriage will get the best out of you, man, whether you know it or not. It'll be one of those things where you want to go that extra mile. And sometimes when somebody soothes you and you soothe them back, you know, it gives them that little extra to continue on, but you got to do it the right way, you know, with gratitude. And I think sometimes we forget that. Gratitude is a great thing, you know. And the next thing is sharing of labor. That's another thing right there. That's even better. You'll always have another set of hands around the house. You know, you can have somebody to wash dishes and have somebody else to do the lawn, you know, and do all kind of little different stuff around the house. You can paint together, you know, and listen to music and all kind of stuff, man. It's just, you can take turns taking the kids to school, you know, all kind of stuff like that. Division of labor is big. People don't understand, man. Sometimes you have kids that have to go to different things at different times. You have one kid to go to soccer practice and another one go to, you know, dance recital. And sometimes you have to split and decide, hey, who gonna do what? So every now and then you rotate. There's also some things that come in there too, like dentist appointments and all kind of stuff. You have to take them to the doctor's appointment. That stuff takes a lot out of you, and you don't want to put all that on one person because they have to take all the time off from work and to make it seem like they avoiding work. But if you split that up, and who does what, and who, that's a good thing. I think all fathers should know who their kid's dentist is and doctor is. You know what I'm saying? That way you have a relationship with them. That way you'll be involved with what the next steps are. That type of thing. So I think one of those things that you have to do is make sure that you're involved. And division of labor is one of those intangibles that you just can't buy. You think about, that's the main reason why most people stick together. When you have kids, you got somebody to help raise them. And that's a good thing. You want to do it from different perspectives too. Your wife may see something a little bit different than you see it. When y'all come together and you have an agreement, but you got to learn how to work together. You got to be able to make sure you reach an agreement. Talked about that earlier this week. And another thing too, man, if something happens to your spouse, you can also draw from Social Security and pension. And we talked about that earlier. Also life insurance too. What happens to one spouse if one dies before the house is not paid off? That's a financial strain. Because 9 times out of 10, when most people set up their houses, usually they'll try to do a house where they have both incomes or one income. And then the next thing you know, that income is gone. How you going to replace that? Insurance. And that's another thing we have to get good at too. Talking about stuff like that, making sure that we're financially sound. And I think sometimes when you make little decisions like, going out to eat versus paying your insurance, I think you'll understand the importance of making sure that you cook this time and then, you set aside other time to do other things. But make sure you got the stuff in place, insurance, and have it on everybody, because you never know. It could be your spouse. It could be your child. It could be a loved one, a parent. It's one of those things as us, as Black folks, we don't usually, talk about stuff like that. But make sure if you don't have an opportunity to get with an insurance professional, and make sure y'all had that conversation to make sure that you understand exactly you have the coverage that you need, because certain life events may require you to make adjustments. Like if you get a new baby, you might want to make sure you put the baby on insurance. If you get married, make sure you understand who's covering whose insurance, that type of thing. So you want to make sure everybody's covered. It's always a good thing. That's another thing too. We shouldn't have to, be passing the hat every time something happens to somebody. We should be responsible for stuff like that, Also, another thing that is an intangible, man, is to make sure that you have a safe place for emotional growth. I think sometimes I heard Shaq say a long time ago, he was like, man, don't tell your girl your problems. And I think the fellas came to a consensus. No, you want to tell, because they use it against you. And I'm thinking to myself, well, maybe we married the wrong person if we can't tell them what's really going on. Can I be transparent with you? That type of thing. Can they be transparent with me? Will they use against me what I tell them? That type of thing. And I think that the jury is out. I think, ladies, y'all gonna have to get back to being better nurturers, because the ones that we've been seeing lately ain't really that good. They'll take what you said and use it against you, and all type of stuff like that. But if you do your work on the front end, you don't have to worry about that on the back end. If you got your spouse the way you have her the way you should have it, I think that's the best way to do it. But you want to make sure that you have a safe space for emotional growth, And the last thing I want to talk to you guys about is assistance during crisis moments. You never know when you have a loved one, a spouse pass away, or a parent pass away. God forbid, if you have a child to pass away. Sometimes you have to be strong for that person. It's either somebody in your family or somebody in the other person's family. And also make sure you understand that grief counseling is important too, because we don't always have all the answers, but you want to make sure you get around professionals who know exactly what they're doing. Sometimes we like to think that we know what we're doing or whatever, but ain't nothing like having professional help who can think clearly, who don't have a vested interest in that particular situation to lean one way or the other. So they're strictly for you, instead of having their portion in it too. Having a village outside of your marriage is always good. So counseling is always important. You want to make sure you check in and check up from the outside, especially during crisis situations. So I think that's one of those things we need to think about. So with that being said, I think that is just the tip of the iceberg. Those are some of the intangibles that marriage has. So when we think about marriage has tangibles and intangibles. I think sometimes people like to think about it depending upon where they are in life. What do I get out of it? Those are the tangibles. I'm here to tell you, there ain't many tangibles. The ones you want to think about are the intangibles, the things that you can't buy, the things you can't acquire on your own. You know what I mean? Though I think those are the things that allow you to take life's journey and take it the distance. I heard one of our fellow podcasters when I was cutting up film today. He was saying that make sure you get somebody you can take the distance with you. He said a successful marriage is, when you make it all the way to the end and you guys have, done everything you said you agreed upon doing, love, honor, cherish, obey, forsaking all others. And if you can make it to the end and you guys did what you need to do, I think life was worth living together with that particular person. Now, with that being said, your spouse is probably the most important decision that you'll probably ever make in your life, even more than what job you're going to work. So make sure you get somebody that they understand that your family is number one priority. I tell people in a minute, I say, I'll quit a job in a minute. My family, I'll never quit. Never quit. You know what I mean? Because sometimes your families are going to be there when your job's not. Your job can get rid of you. All the PhD and all this other stuff, man, that stuff don't mean nothing. You want to make sure that you make your family business the family at all times. With that being said, that's going to wrap it up for our 4-part series. Next week, we're going to talk about something different. We're going to get down to the nuts and bolts on why certain situations like this thing we're going to talk about, let it be a surprise next week when we talk about why some people try to get out of being married. The myths, that people hear along the way. Just like earlier this time, we talked about what people thought about marriage and how women couldn't always buy this and couldn't do this and didn't have bank accounts. And we went over that stuff and saw that was a bunch of malarkey. You know what I'm saying? We've always had money and we've always been able to do what we have to do. And besides, it's 2025. There's nothing that you can't do anyway. We just have to learn how to work a little bit better together. So we're going to dive into the next topic next Thursday. And I'm looking forward to seeing you guys here. If you guys have any questions, you can always hit them up. I'll give y'all about 2 minutes to say what you need to say. If you want to come up, you can. That's fine. Outside of that, we're going to wrap this thing up. If you got any questions. Also, if you guys get an opportunity, man, make sure you guys donate to the channel, man. Black Man Unfiltered. Let me see where your stuff at, man. I'll put that in the channel. Make sure you support the channel. Black Man Unfiltered comes up with these great topics, man, all the time. We want to make sure that we're doing what we have to do to give you the content that you need. Also, when you guys get an opportunity, make sure you check out the shorts. That helps on the algorithm. Make sure you guys check out the content, because I'm pretty sure Black Man's going to run this back in the morning time and cut it up as well too. Sometimes when we cut this stuff up, we don't always realize how much wisdom we kick out until we go back and let AI do its thing and go out and pull all the nuggets. I'm like, man, I didn't even know all that was in there until after the fact. So make sure you guys go back and you check out the condensed form, so that way you get as much as you can, and then that way you can share the little clips when you can, because I think you can hold people's attention for about maybe about a minute or so, where 30 and 40 minutes won't do it. So I appreciate you guys. If you have any questions, feel free to let us know. Also, hit us up in the content, man, in the bottom in the comments after the show. Leave your comments. Let us know what you think, man. If you have any topics you want us to cover, let us know, and we'd be more than happy to hit you up. But outside, that's it. Appreciate you guys for coming out. Thanks out for coming out. Another, In Between the Lines podcast, and also Black Man Unfiltered once again. and also another production of Lost in Translation podcast. Thank you guys, and good night.